just shout when I get there. So I'll just introduce myself. I'm Pippa Langford, I'm Principal Specialist Recreation and Access. I'm also the co-chair, or one of the co-chairs of Outdoor Recreation Network. So I'm very, very glad to be here. When our Secretariat proposed that we come to Ireland and they showed me a picture of Glendalough, that was it. Deal done. Yeah, we were coming. So, I'll just explain what we've been doing in terms of data, Greenspace mapping in particular, in England. The presentation was largely put together by my colleague Jane Houghton, who works on green infrastructure and accessible natural green space. So my thanks to her for doing a lot of the legwork on this one. So, we talk about green infrastructure a lot in England because the emphasis tends to be on the spaces, though we are making the links to the people, and I'll show you how that happens in England. But just, if you haven't got a definition of green infrastructure, this is the one that we use. It's in our National Planning Policy Framework, which is the whole thing that governs land use planning in England. So a very important document, and it's the one that all the local authorities have to refer to, and they have to put all their plans together following the National Planning Policy Framework, or NPPF as we like to call it. So green infrastructure does lots of things. It's not just about accessible green infrastructure. It's about flooding, it's about water, it's about air quality, it's about places for people to go, it's about allotments, it's sport, it's all those places. And the emphasis in the slide pictures tends to be urban, because that's where a lot of green infrastructure is put in, but it does cover rural areas as well, though there's been less emphasis so far, but that should probably shift. So, we've got lots of legislation and policy which it sits in. So as I said, we've got our National Planning Policy Framework. We have a National Design Guide and National Model Design Code. Those, when you get the presentation, those are live links and will take you to write the right documents. We've got an Environment Act 2021, and we've got an Environmental Improvement Plan 2023, which talks about providing better places for people to go and be more active, and connecting people with nature. We've had a couple of cycling and walking strategies. They tend to be very urban focused, but recently there's been a sort of an awakening that actually we need to start thinking about rural areas, because, dare I say, that's where a lot of the cycling deaths happen, is rural areas. And we're thinking about implementing stuff to do with flooding, and of course this all relates to the UN Biodiversity Conference COP15, which references access to nature and access to green space. So there's lots of policy around this area, but how do we actually make that happen in the right places and to the right quality? That's where we're finding it's quite difficult. So, within Natural England, we've got a bunch of aims around this. We want to improve existing infrastructure and create more infrastructure. We want to make sure that everyone has access to good places to go, so that nobody's left behind. We want to support local authorities, because they're the key people who can do this, a lot of this. And we want to make this the way things are done, rather than the add-on after we finish building the housing estate, which is what we've tended to see in the past, is you build the housing estate and oops, there's nowhere for people to go. And they're all getting in their cars because there's no paths for them to walk on. So we're trying to make sure that it's built into the way things are done in the future. So there's a whole load of documents which you can go and have a look at. These are all on the web. So the green infrastructure principles, we've got some green infrastructure mapping, which I'll show you a bit of today. I won't talk you through all the technical detail, but it is all available on the web, so if you want to see how we did it, and all the caveats and all of that, there's lots of information that you can go and use and mine and replicate. Steal whatever you like. We've also talked about green infrastructure standards, and I'll show you what we've done so far. And we've got all our design guides, and we also talk about process, so that people can go, well, how do I do this? So it's not just the policy, it's right, I want to do this, how am I going to go about doing that? I'm going the wrong way. So the principles. There's three things behind the principles. There's the why. Why are we doing this? Because people need to understand why would I bother? You know, I've got my housing targets to hit. I need to stop flooding. I need to get people healthier. I'm too busy thinking about all these other things. That's what our first reaction tends to be, and we kind of go, but this is the solution. We're doing this because this is the solution to lots of your other problems. So why? We want nature-rich, beautiful places. We want active and healthy people. So we know there is a connection between having enough places to go out and about and people being active. We want thriving communities. We know that lovely places to live tend to be more prosperous. And we think there is definitely a link between those. We need places to be resilient to climate change. And we need improved water management because we need water to be cleaner when it reaches our rivers. So those are all the whys. And then the how, the what, it wants to be multifunctional. You don't have to have a place that only does one thing and another place that does something else. You can get lots of functions out of a single bit of green space. It needs to be varied. If it's all the same, it's boring, isn't it? Connected, accessible, people need to be able to use it. And it needs to be responsive to the local character, so it looks right in its surroundings. And then we talk about the how, which is partnership. This is not a top-down thing, this is people doing it for themselves. It's based on the evidence, so we supply a lot of that evidence. We want people to plan strategically, so it's not just a bolt-on at the end. It needs to be designed well, so that it can be managed and valued and be there in perpetuity. So we've thought about the principles in terms of how this should happen. And then we've got some standards. So we have some headline standards, and there's all sorts of stuff behind this. There's general green infrastructure strategy standard, there's accessible green space standards, urban nature recovery standard, greening factor. We're trying to make our urban areas greener because we know that means they're cooler, they're nicer to live in, they're good for biodiversity, they're better for people. And we're talking about an urban tree canopy standard. So those are all the things that go into green infrastructure. And then I'm going to just delve a bit deeper into the accessible green infrastructure standard because that's most relevant to us lot. So government's got a commitment to have green space for people within 15 minutes. And of course you'll understand the length of debate about what that means. How far can you walk in 15 minutes? Are you doing a fit person's walk or an unfit person's walk? And are they pushing a push? You get the point. But we've said everybody's going to have access to good quality green space within 15 minutes from home. And so what we've been looking at is what that means. Is that a little tiny patch or a bigger patch? How big does it have to be? So we've been looking at making sure that that green space is good quality, so it meets the Green Flag Award. And what we've got is we've got a commitment to have it embedded in new major development, which of course is really good because then we're building better places from scratch. And then we've got our accessible green infrastructure standards, which are about the size of the space and the distance you have to go to get to it. Because understandably you can't have huge spaces next to everybody, because otherwise you wouldn't have a town, would you? So you've got your doorstep or local green space, which is the smallest stuff, which is closest to home. And then as you go further and further away, the space needs to be bigger, but it's more attractive because you can do more in it. So the biggest one is the sub-regional green space, which is 500 hectares, but it's within 10 kilometres. So probably a bus ride, a cycle ride, or a very, very long, or a slightly long walk. So who has green space near them? And interestingly, this is the whole of England. So notice the thing across the bottom only goes up to 60%. So if we're looking at all green space meeting having all those standards, only 60% of the population have any green space that meets those standards. So 40% don't have anything within those standards. But if we're talking about doorstep green space, which is the smallest one, that's about, reading the graph from here, about 30%. Only 20-odd% have local natural green space, and somewhere like 40–50% have neighbourhood green space. So it's not great, is it? We don't have lots of green space. So we've got our green infrastructure mapping, and we've thought about how it can be used. So I can't read the slide from here, unfortunately. I'll have to come round. So you start in the top left-hand corner, and that's the map of green space. And then you can look about who doesn't have green space. So that's the one in the bottom left-hand corner. And then you can map the proximity, and then you can map and look at how that maps onto deprivation as well. So we've built into our mapping the indices of multiple deprivation. So what is the green infrastructure standard? How green is your neighbourhood? Who lives within 1 kilometre? And where do the gaps matter most? So where you don't have green space and you have high levels of deprivation. And we've done some analysis at different levels. So on the left, it shows that the areas of accessible green space broken down by indices of multiple deprivation. So a low number, so 1 and 2, is the most deprived. So they have the least green space. And as you work across the graph, those at number 10 don't have the most green space, but they still have a lot more than people who are most deprived. So it's interesting that if you have a low income, you're less likely to have any green space. And we know that has a health impact. And interestingly, the one on the right shows the percentage of the population within the local green space buffers, broken down by rural and urban. I was very interested to see that the Northern Ireland data is very similar to ours, in that the rural one, which is the sort of bluey-green graph, is way lower than the urban one, which is the red one. So interestingly, you may be in a lovely rural area and look at lots of stuff, but you may not have much access to it. In fact, you're probably less likely to have accessible green space than somebody living in a town. So we also recognise that our public rights of way network is a very important part of accessible green space, particularly in rural areas. So we also mapped the density of rights of way, because we know there is a relationship between the density of paths and how much people use them. So if you have an area with a dense network of paths, people will go out and be out and active in that area more than if they only have a few paths. And so we've mapped the density. Now sometimes areas show up there, airfields, and you think, well, it's all white. Well, you're not going to get any rights of way across an airfield, and you wouldn't want to. But interestingly, you can also find areas, villages, in places which will have no public rights of way and no accessible green space. So what we've done in our green space mapping is we've looked at combining green space and public rights of way inequalities. So this is a map of a lot of England, and you can see very much there is a divide. So if you're in the east, you get the red stuff, which is bad. And if you're in the west, the light blue is actually the best. The darker blue, not quite so good. But you can see there's definitely an east-west divide in the amount of accessible stuff that you've got. And it's interesting that the impacts that has. So if you look at the data on health impacts, particularly if you look at Lincolnshire's, which is sort of the middle of that bit, look at their health data. Health in rural Lincolnshire is pretty bad, and also it then has knock-on impacts on nature, because everybody in Lincolnshire tends to go to the coast, and the coast is really important for nature and for birds and for seals, but that's where everybody goes for a walk because they don't have anywhere else to go. So it has multiple impacts if we don't look after people and give them enough spaces for them to go. So how do we then apply all of this, because it's all very well having all this data, but how do we actually make sure that people use it? So we've got lots of guides, so we're looking to local planning authorities to use it, to develop partnerships and visions, to use our evidence, to then develop their own local plans, so they're planning strategically, to develop their own GI policies, to integrate their GI strategy into all their plans, and then hopefully managing some monitoring to monitor what's going on. And this can be done at all sorts of levels. So the local plan that has to develop the local planning authority that has to develop their local plans, but also the developers, so the housing developers and all of those people and their design teams need to use this. And also we have neighbourhood plans in England, so all the neighbourhoods can go in and they can use this data and they can think about it for themselves and develop their own neighbourhood plans, sort of parish level. So one example I've got is Mayfield Park in Manchester. It's Manchester's first new city centre park for 100 years because the data showed actually Manchester needed a new green space. So it was an old urban development site which was no longer needed for whatever it was needed. It wasn't used for industry anymore. And the river had been completely culverted and it had a warehouse on top of it. The warehouse went out, they opened up the river, so now you can actually see the river, and it's got a bit of space to flood, and it's got lots of play space, natural play space for people, and doesn't it look gorgeous compared to, what could we have had? Car park perhaps? That's what they would have done in the past, isn't it? They'd have stuck a multi-storey car park, and they've realised that perhaps a park might be nicer. Another example of how this is being used, a colleague of mine working up in Liverpool has high indices of multiple deprivation. He got together with the National Health Service in Liverpool, lots of NHS colleagues, people from GP practices, from the hospitals, and talked them through the Greenspace data and the air quality data and the flooding data and the water quality data, and he showed them all this data. And wow, they really took it on board. And this is a health person writing down all the opportunities they can get from improving natural green space in their area. So they've really cottoned on to green space, and finding places for people to go is really important to ease the burden on our hospitals and our GP practices, because we can't cope. So we need to stop people coming through the door, and wouldn't that be a good thing if they didn't get in the first place? So that's great, and they've really cottoned on. Get the big things right. If you have really good, lovely green spaces where people can be active, where there's some natural green space combined with maybe some sports stuff, people to walk, places for people to run, and it does stuff for flooding, and it reduces the heat island effect, and it reduces air pollution impacts, wouldn't that be great? So, the future. We're not stopping. We're going to do more stuff. So, we want to put in new content, particularly Census 21, because our population data is old, because it was all we had at the time. We want to do more stuff around urban greening, the heat island impact, the air quality impact, sustainable drainage. And we want to put in some stuff around urban habitat maps. And what we found is national governments beginning to realise and recognise the quality of this data and its relevance to their bigger agendas about levelling up. So when the government was considering funding for levelling up, social levelling up, they used our data around accessible natural green space and looked at places which didn't have much accessible natural green space and used it to guide where they spent their money. So it's having a national impact back up the chain to actually influence spending, which is great. It's what needs to happen. So, thank you very much. There's lots of information on the web, and that's a live link to our Green Infrastructure Network, and that's my address and Jane Hunt's address if you have any more questions.